Hello, lovely people. This is Professor Matt, and welcome back to the Too Many Guys Soccer Show and Too Many Guys Soccer Show history. Right? This is the first episode of what's probably going to be at least a 5 or 6 part series dealing with the intersection of football and decolonization. Right. And I had planned this, or like roughly planned it last year when I was wrapping up the 3 part football and fascism series. And I figured this would be a lot of fun, especially because there is no international tournament this summer. So I figured I'd do more of stuff like this. And originally, I was hoping to get the first episode out second half of January, sometime in February. The semester happened, right? And midterm grading hell happened. So this has been kind of on the back burner, unfortunately. But here we are. And right, my hope is that I can get the next 2 episodes out in April and in May. So, one a month. And the next 2 episodes are going to be just me talking about, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about this today, but more about it in class. Wow. Professor Brain. I'm on spring break. I shouldn't be thinking about class. More about this today. But the next 2 episodes are going to be about aspects of football and decolonization dealing with the 1966 World Cup in Britain. So the next episode's going to be about the boycott by the African Federation over the inclusion of South Africa, who didn't qualify for the tournament, by the way, but the fact that FIFA was still like doing business with them. Right. And in May, I figured I'd cut an episode dealing with North Korea, right? Because North Korea does show up to that World Cup, and they are the first non-European or uh, Latin American side to get to the knockout stages. Right? They survive a group that included Chile, Italy, and a pretty good Soviet Union squad. So those are going to be the next two. And then during the summer, I hope to get a couple compadres, from the pod on to discuss some topics. I know I want to discuss Algeria and France with Stead. Right. So maybe that will be in June. And then, right, I want to cut a Palestinian episode. And I think that might be a weird crossover with Scouts and Celtics. So I think Cam will join me for that. Not certain about that yet, but more about that as things progress. So, what are we going to start off with? Well, I kind of like the fascism series. I am going to do the professor thing in a few minutes and just sort of broadly speak about decolonization, what it is, what it's not. Right. But for this first episode, I figured let's start with Ghana, right? Because Ghana is the first sub-Saharan African country to achieve political independence, uh, you know, after the Second World War. And right, its first leader, Kwame Nkrumah, was not just a degenerate football fan. He implicitly understood the connection between football and politics, and football and nation building, and football and decolonization, right? So strap yourselves in. Before I get to Ghana, though, and the meat of what we're going to talk about today, just some very general things about decolonization. Decolonization is, well, first of all, it's an ongoing process, right? We're not out of the era of decolonization. In fact, we're very much still in it, which I think explains a lot of the issues in the world today. But it's a process that begins really with the First World War. I mean, we associate it with the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And indeed, that's when most of the formal colonies that the Western powers had in Africa and in Asia achieved independence. But really, it begins with World War One. And right, it's that process of taking the world that imperialism created in the 19th century and undoing it. Right. And that can take many different forms. It's not doesn't just mean the formal independence of a country. It also means, what kind of economic system you're going to use, what is your national language, what is your history, et cetera, et cetera. And that's going to be an ongoing theme during this series, and indeed, especially today. Right. So the two world wars are big in understanding decolonization, right? Because the two world wars really, in a way, it's kind of like a screwed up, finishing school, a highly violent finishing school for the decolonizing world, right? Because all of the two world wars were fundamentally fought about empire, and all of these empires mass mobilized not just their populations in the metropole, but also in their colonial possessions. And by the way, if you think about Russia like as a empire, or the Soviet Union as an empire, ditto that. Right. So you have this mass mobilization of colonial peoples. And it's also this moment of really politicization of these peoples, right? Because they're exposed to all these different ideas. And they also see firsthand, look, the colonizers full of shit. This is why it really begins with World War One, because Woodrow Wilson opens his goddamn mouth and says, self-determination of peoples. Well, but then the war ends, and it's like, nah, that only applies to like Poland. It doesn't apply to your Jamaican ass. It doesn't apply to your Arab ass. It doesn't apply to your Korean ass. Right. So massively raised expectations, dashed hopes. Right. You also have the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which is fundamentally anti-imperialist, even though the Soviet Union itself is kind of an empire, although it looked a lot different from sort of the French, the British, etc. empires, right? So, that gets thrown into the works. And yeah, too, like, imperialism functioned partially on this idea of the civilizing mission, and this the way that colonial peoples internalized this civilizing mission, internalized this inferiority. Uh the two world wars destroyed that. I'm sorry, after the atomic bomb in Auschwitz, there is no freaking civilizing mission, because Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, etc., could turn to their colonial overlords and say, look, you are the people that kill people in the millions, not us. Don't lecture me about civilization ever, ever again, please. But then it really picks up right after the Second World War and the coming of the Cold War. And decolonization in a very real way drives the Cold War as much as the Cold War drives decolonization. Both the Soviet Union and the United States are, in theory, anti-colonial powers. Like the Soviet Union, if you're a Marxist, it's kind of obvious that you would be for struggles of national liberation. In the case of the United States, the United States after World War II kept pressing Britain, France, the Dutch, etc., to get the hell out of their colonies, because they were like, look, we're fighting this Cold War thing, man. And if you don't, these newly independent countries that are going to be independent regardless are going to go over the other side. And we don't want that. And indeed, the Cold War feeds decolonization, but decolonization feeds the Cold War. Right. And these are important dynamics. More about this towards the end of today's segment, right? Because what ultimately happens in Ghana, Nkrumah's project is a casualty of the Cold War. Right. So, the Cold War is definitely important here. And the Cold War provided these decolonizing movements with space, right? Because and not just the Cold War between West and East, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and, right, the People's Republic of China. And briefly there too in the 60s, kind of the Soviet Union and Cuba, right? Because after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cubans aren't the biggest, they're not warm and fuzzy about the Soviets there for a while. So like these different, newly independent countries could play all the different sides off upon one another, right? And get in many ways the best sort of deals. You also had the non-aligned movement, which is a direct byproduct of the Cold War, which was primarily all the decolonizing states plus Tito's Yugoslavia, right, that formed a very important and very influential voting bloc in the United Nations. That cannot be underestimated. I know that the non-aligned movement still exists and it's kind of a joke thing now, but in the late 50s and in the 60s and in the 70s, the non-aligned movement mattered, and it mattered big time. It was the non-aligned movement that brought the question of apartheid and essentially boycotting and sanctioning South Africa to the international community. They were the first people to be talking about the Palestinian cause, right? Wasn't the Soviet Union, certainly wasn't the West. It was the non-aligned movement that was the first ones to sort of champion the Palestinians. So the non-aligned movement was incredibly important in all this. Uh, One of the things that I really want to stress in this series, not just this episode, is decolonization is never a non-violent event. There's no such thing as non-violent decolonization, in so much that decolonization is at its core revolutionary. It is a revolution, right? And even if there aren't dead bodies, it is a violent transformation and creation, right? Because you have to destroy what the colonizer did and set up, and then create something brand new. And guys, that's hard. As one of my better students in a global 20th century class once said when we were talking about decolonization, shout out to him, he's from Nigeria. I quote, nation building is a motherfucker. And it is. Nation building, even in a non-colonial setting, is hard because you have to determine who you are, kind of who you're not, uh, what's your history, who are your heroes, who are your myths, what kind of economic system are you going to use, what's your language, this, that, the other. These things are hard, and these things apply not just to newly independent states. And think about, again, going back to it's hard. In the case of Africa, like Ghana, which we're going to talk about today, look, their borders weren't drawn by them. They were drawn literally by British dudes with maps and crayons. Ditto the modern Middle East, etc. All borders are artificial. These borders are particularly artificial. So, like, the British leave, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, okay, I'm Nigerian. What's Nigeria? Is Nigeria Muslim? Right, there's a lot of Muslims in the north. Is Nigeria Christian? Because there's a bunch of Christians in the south. Is it Igbo? Is it, so these tensions were like built up by the colonizer when they were there, especially the British. The British loved playing different ethnic and linguistic and religious groups off upon one another because if they were fighting amongst themselves for like crumbs, that meant that they were not coming together and driving the British out. You see this certainly in India, etc. So nation building is goddamn hard, and nation building is at its core what decolonization is about. Not just in the colonies, mind, in the former colonial metropoles. And I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about this when we talk about, France and Algeria, right? Like, it's not just decolonize, it's not just the former colonized peoples decolonizing themselves. It's also the colonizers decolonizing their own history, decolonizing their own mentalities, decolonizing their own institutions. Uh, the British Empire has been dead for a long time, longer than it probably wants to admit. But if you go to Britain, you talk to some Brits, the colonial mentality and all the nasty stuff like racism that's involved with that. That's still very much there, guys. And especially, again, I'm sure we're going to have a lot to say when we talk about France. Right. And that's what I mean. Decolonization is a ongoing process. It's not just colonizer leaves, country is independent. No, that's like the first step. And it's, again, not just the former colonies finding their way and really achieving, actual independence. It's also the former colonizers too, right? And if you think about this notion of what is your history, who are your good guys, who are your bad guys, etc., Christ, I mean, doesn't this speak to the conversations that are going on in places like the United States, like Western Europe, and certainly, right, the post-Soviet space? Like the post-Soviet space, I think, is a really insightful example of all of this, right? Because the Soviet Union is still collapsing, but so too is the British, French, American empires. So decolonization is always a violent process, and it's an ongoing process. And if you don't believe me about it being a violent process, let me introduce you to my homeboy, Franz Fanon. Uh, I I love Fanon, and I love this particular text, The Wretched of the Earth. I teach it every semester, it seems like. Usually it shows up in at least one of my classes. Uh, this is Fanon on decolonization. My stuff's falling over. National liberation, national reawakening, restoration of the nation to the people or commonwealth. Whatever the name used, whatever the latest expression, decolonization is always a violent event. At whatever level we study it, individual encounters, a change of the name of a sports club, aha, the guest list of a cocktail party, members of a police force, or the board of directors of a state or private bank. Decolonization is quite simply the substitution of one species, in air quotes, doesn't literally mean species, uh, of mankind with another. The substitution is unconditional, absolute, total, and seamless. And so I think that quote, which I quote a lot in my classes, really kind of sums up what I've been talking about and what we're going to continue talking about throughout this series, right? Uh, again, going back to my one student, nation building is fucking hard. It's a motherfucker. Right? And one way which you can nation build, and we've seen this already in some of these series, is through sport, right? Because sport and, uh, the clubs you root for, the sports you play, that tells you, and not just you, but also the world, who you are. It is a reflection of your identity and a reflection of, your nation's progress, uh, etc. And not always, it can serve as a unifier, right? And in places, particularly like sub-Saharan Africa, like Ghana, that we're going to talk about, this notion of sports as sort of the glue to unify and in a very real way create. Because when the British leave Ghana, there are no Ghanaians really. Ghana and Ghanaian identity has to be constructed, as indeed all national identities are constructed. Sport, and particularly in Anglophone West Africa, but also Francophone West Africa, sport, particularly football, becomes a major piece of constructing these identities, right? And, Ghana, but also certainly Nigeria, Senegal, Mali, it's part of the identity. So why did I choose Ghana, right? Because I could have chosen, well, if I chosen one of the French places, I'd have to have Stead on. So even though we're going to mainly be talking about Algeria, more about that in another episode. I could have chose out Nigeria, right? But I didn't. And the reason I didn't is because Ghana is a wonderful test case for these things that I've been talking about. Because when most non-Ghanaians, Americans in particular, think about Ghana, their frame of reference is probably jollof and football. And that's probably it, right? When you talk to most Americans, it's like, oh, Ghana. Ghana was that African team that got to the quarterfinals of the World Cup in 2010. Yeah, the Black Stars, right. Ghana, Ghanaian identity and the Ghanaian quote unquote brand that, everyone knows in the world and football go together like bacon and eggs. And that was by design. It was by design. So let me take you back before I take you real back to the summer and really the immediate aftermath of the 2010 World Cup, which was the first held in the African continent. Right. Ghana got to the quarterfinals and probably would have gotten to the semis if it wasn't for you know, one Luis Suarez and Gian missing the penalty. Right. They could have easily gotten to the semifinals, which would have made them the first African side to do so. Morocco finally got over that hump. Right. So even after the World Cup in 2010, Ghana remained intensely proud of their national football team's achievements. Roadside shack dwellings, corporate edifices, and advertising billboards were festooned with the iconography of the national team, the Black Stars, and particularly their prominent players, most notably Michael Essien, who was the captain of that squad. A range of prominent politicians eager to accrue the political capital that comes from association with successful national sports. That's the other thing too, right? If you want to cement your, regime, your particular, rule, sport is a reflection of that. We saw that, we've seen that before in the series. So, hey, if you're an aspiring politician, you want to attach yourself to this. Right. Uh, Association with successful national sport team were also featured in the congratulatory football related imagery. These posters were particularly prominent. So you had a bunch of like after the World Cup, there were these pictures of like Michael Essien and the team, but also Ghanaian politicians. Uh, the first captured a photograph of then Ghanaian President John Atta Mills holding the World Cup trophy below the slogan, "Let us rally around the flag and support the Black Stars." That just seems like political advertisement. But if you're Ghanaian, that's not just a political advertisement because that quote goes back because that quote is not from the what was then the president of Ghana. That is a direct quote from Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, on the importance of the Ghanaian national football team and the sport in Ghana, but also this notion of rallying around using the Black Stars as a way to rally around this flag so that these various ethnic groups, linguistic groups, can become Ghanaian. Christians, Muslims, Ashanti, etc. So, how the hell does football come to Ghana in the first place? Well, it comes, via the British, right? Ghana was not Ghana initially. It's just called the Gold Coast, right? Because there was gold there, and that's one of the reasons why the British showed up in the first place, steal your shit. Uh, and it comes over, we think, as early as the 1870s. So, right, the British had been in the Gold Coast for a while already. And right, by the 1870s, they've set up plantations. So and right, in the ports there's a lot of British there. So the, the the football comes to the Gold Coast relatively early, relatively early. However, at first it's just a white guy's game, right? It's a game which the British administrators, the civil servants, the military, but also these planters, right? These plantation owners, play on their free time. Uh, but it wasn't the only game, right? Rugby comes in, cricket comes in. And right, if you think about the British Empire in Africa, it's weird. So like South Africa gets rugby. East Africa kind of gets rugby, like Zimbabwe's half decent, but they really get cricket. Like when you think of British East Africa, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Kenya, you think cricket. The West African colonies, for whatever reason, and there's a doctoral dissertation waiting to be written about this. So if someone wants to go, go. Ghana and Nigeria, you think football, right? Cricket doesn't do well here. Neither really does rugby. Rugby doesn't take on in West Africa, the way it does in sort of the southern part of the British Empire in Africa, right? So by the 1920s, you have established native clubs. You have clubs for the white people, but now you have native indigenous African clubs, right? And the European clubs, English clubs, uh, would make tours of the colonies at this time to promote the sport, but also to promote other things. So, right in the 1940s, so this is actually after World War II. Right, there's a football tour. Uh, it's the English national team, and they show up to Nigeria, Gold Coast, and then Uganda, and then Trinidad, Tobago, and Jamaica. Right. Uh, the agenda of these tours was to grow the sport, but there's other things going on here. The agenda was always routed in politics. It was to instill in the minds of Africans and Afro Caribbeans, right? Because they hit up the Caribbean too. Uh, an attitude that was sympathetic to capitalism, right, and Western ideas, and to illustrate how superior the British economic and political system was to potentially an alternative, at that time, Eastern European Soviet model. Right. So you have these barnstorming tours in the colonies where these, the English national team, or in some cases, English club teams, would tour the colonies. But this wasn't just to grow the game, it was to be like the British model is the correct model. See our football. Our football is good, therefore, all things British, all things Western are good. So by the 20s and the 30s, there are indigenous African clubs, and there's like amateur leagues throughout the Gold Coast colony. Right. But football, again, there's always this political element. It's not just an imported game, right? To demonstrate and it's being propagated to demonstrate imported ideas and imported the superiority, the inherent superiority of imported ideas. But, right, it's also used not to unify the indigenous population of this colony, but rather sort of to divide it, right? Because in British colonial Ghana, in the Gold Coast, there's kind of two centers of football. One is based around the old Ashanti Kingdom in the north, and another in the south is based in the colonial capital in the south, Accra. And right, so you already have these clubs like Heart of Oak, etc., that are established in the colony. But there's this historic rivalry between the teams from the south based around Agra, and the Ashanti teams in the north, that's pretty bitter, right? Because the Gold Coast, the colony itself, is actually mashed together, as indeed a lot of these colonies were, of two very different previously existing places or kingdoms that the British simply envelop and then they smash together into this one administrative unit. And football in the colonial era in Ghana or become Ghana really actually says a lot more about the divisions within this colonial society and these divisions that the British want to keep going, right? Because when these different groups, these different linguistic groups don't, are, arguing amongst each other, and there's this rivalry that's also a sporting rivalry. That's great because we can keep stealing your shit. You're not focused on us. Uh, so football had come and had a long history in the colony. but it had been used to sort of divide and rule. Then in the early 50s comes along Kwame Nkrumah and his uh, Convention People's Party. Nkrumah was a Pan-Africanist, right? He'd also spent a lot of time in the United States. He had ties with the civil rights movement here. He had ties with civil rights and rights activists in Europe and in the Caribbean, right? So he's a Pan-Africanist. He was also a socialist. He wasn't a Soviet state. He wasn't a straight up Marxist. He had his own notions of African socialism, and he believed that traditional African socioeconomic ideas were effectively socialist in nature, and that an independent Africa should first be united, right? This notion of Pan-African unity. United we are strong, divided we are weak. United we can be independent, divided the white people are just going to neo-colonize us. And he was a committed socialist. Again, not a Marxist socialist, but a socialist nonetheless, because he believed that traditional African ideas of social justice, created kind of, in his own words, a distinctive African socialism. In 1951, his convention, People's Party, wins in a landslide local legislative elections within the colony. And his party is, you know, totally for self rule. And so this is a big moment because the British are starting already to think, okay, we've gotten out of India already, we've gotten out of Burma, we're winding down things in North Africa. The tide is turning. I guess Winston Churchill remembered those conversations he had with Roosevelt and Stalin at the end of World War II, when both of them were like, you have to give up your empire because the world's changed. The British realize the world's changing. And right, they're also seeing like the stuff that the French are going through in Indochina and soon in Algeria, where if you don't leave timely, the local people will bomb you the F out. And they want to avoid that at all costs. So the British start packing up and thinking about leaving, right? Now, Nkrumah, he's, it's still a colony, but he's seeing the need for this new nation to be unified. And it's interesting. So, football had historically played this role as a tool of the colonizer. But Nkrumah, I guess he listened to punk rock. He got postmodernism or something. He's like, nah, we're gonna take this thing that the colonizer gave us and has been used to divide us along, ethnic lines, linguistic lines, tribal lines. We're gonna use this thing, which is extremely popular in this country, to unify Ghana. And ultimately, in his mind, to unify Africa itself, because he had big dreams. So after 1951, one of the first things this, sort of native led, veering towards independence, you know, really advisory, because it's not an independent government, but it's a native advisory thing. Start setting up is a proper indigenous united Ghanaian football league, right? Uh where, because before then there were a bunch of different leagues. They were very regional. Sometimes these teams would play one another, but it's going to be this unified league. So finally, a couple years later, in 1957, the British, they say it's time to go. And right, this is 57, so this is 1 year after the embarrassment of the Suez Crisis. And right, Britain sees the writing on the wall. So they get up and they pack up. But what they leave, and this is what goes back to nation building, what they leave looks a lot like what was before. So this is Ghana at independence, right? Ghana was a typical colonial economy based on the production and export of a single commodity, coca bean. The coca trade was dominated by a monopolistic company, the Coca Marketing Company, based in, you guessed it, London. So your entire economy is built around the production of cocoa beans, and the company that owns the monopoly of all the cocoa beans is British. So all of the wealth of your country you don't own. It's going back to the former colonizer. Uh, so there's that. And right, this company managed the sale of all of uh managed the sale of the whole of Ghanaian production, mainly for British markets. The trade made Ghana dependent on Britain, which was the main source of its foreign revenue. So, right, if you want to develop, you need money, right? That's maybe the shitty thing about capitalism. In order to be good at it, you need capital. Well, how are you going to get the capital? Well, you have to go and borrow it from guess who? British banks. Right. And virtually the only source of precious foreign currency. Right. So you have this economic dependency. Uh, right? And hold on. I'm sorry. For some reason I thought there was more to that quote, and apparently there isn't. But anyway, you get the point. Ghana at the time of independence was effectively, for all intents and purposes, a neo colony of Great Britain, right? Uh so how do you take a country which is formally independent after 1957 and transform that country into an actual independent country? Oh, and that's the other thing too. Ghanaian institutions were modeled explicitly on British ones, right? So their legal system, their educational system, right, their parliamentary system. I'm sorry, I don't know. Maybe I need more caffeine. Right. So, model on the British equivalent. The ruling class was 100% British educated. So again, that's that colonialism of the mind. Like the ruling class thinks like little Brits, and that's maybe kind of a little bit of a problem. And right, the British still commanded the army and the police, and all of the media sources and information was still through the BBC. So you have a country that's independent, but whose economy is totally dependent on your former colonizer. Right, your military, your police, they're effectively they're yours, but they're British. Right. All the information you get is from the BBC. All of your institutions are British. Your ruling class thinks it's British. It has high tea and all that shit. Your judges wear those stupid wigs. You're an independent country, but are you? Not so much. Not so much. And for Nkrumah, he walks into this and he's like, this is political independence is merely step one. We have a big task ahead of us. And right, there's these divisions within the country itself. So when Ghana achieves independence, again, Nkrumah is a football fan, and he understands the importance of sport both domestically and internationally. And so, when the country achieves independence, uh, he's very open about this. This is Nkrumah. We like sports, but we want self-government first so that we can be masters, not servants in our own country. When we get self-governance, this is right before independence, you will be amazed at what we can put into the field at the next Olympic Games. You will also be amazed at the stadiums that will glorify the sporting activities of the new Ghana. So for him, sport and success in sport is huge in this nation building process. If you want to transform Ghana from what is effectively still a colony in everything but name into an independent country and a country which, has arrived on the world stage, it's going to be through sport. And so Nkrumah is heavily, heavily, heavily involved in the formation of not just an indigenous, and this again is pre-independence, Ghanaian football pyramid, but also the national team itself. Uh, Nkrumah used football to reach the whole of the continent because, again, for Nkrumah, his ideological mission wasn't just Ghana. It was, Pan-African unity, continental-wide decolonization. And, his audience wasn't simply the Ghanaian population. It was the entire continent of Africa. Uh, to football to reach the whole of the continent. So he wanted to make sure that the Black Stars of Ghana were a shining example, a showpiece, if you will. Because again, Ghana is the first sub-Saharan, the first black colony to achieve independence. Nkrumah was telling the whole world that there is a coalition called Africa which could compete with any other continent in the game of football. So for uh, Nkrumah, football is huge. It is huge uh, in terms of not just building his own nation, but projecting this pan-African, this African socialist uh, idea of a united, strong, sovereign, independent, economically and politically continent of Africa together. So he's really involved in all of this. And indeed, he is the guy that gives the Ghanaian national team their nickname, Black Stars, which, harkens back partially to Marcus Garvey and the Black Star Line. So, like, Pan-Africanism from, the earlier part of the 20th century, but also to this notion that, look, this is the first sub-Saharan African, Black African nation and national team. And these are going to be quite literally Black stars. Right. Europe has its stars, Brazil has its stars. The Eastern Bloc has their stars. We, Africa, will now have our own stars. We'll have our Black stars. So he, picks out the nickname. He appoints the first manager of the national team, a guy by the name of Charles Kume Yamfi. And right, he in 1960, uh, launches a little just West African specific tournament called the Nakami Nkrumah Gold Cup. This team, this, Ghanaian national team, yeah, they do pretty well. Right? They are in the early 60s, the stars of the continent. They win the AFCON in 1963 and 1965, so they're back-to-back winners. Right? And a lot of people are saying, hey, this is probably going to be the first independent African nation to potentially get to the World Cup. The problem, of course, with getting to the World Cup is that because of, it's the Colonizers Cup, there's only one African slot, and you have to go through a fucked up playoff uh, with the Asian, with an Asian team to get there. So there's no guaranteed African participation of the World Cup at this time. And this really, really, really bothers Nkrumah. Right? And indeed, uh, Nkrumah, as early as 1960, starts really banging the table at FIFA and recruiting these other sub-Saharan, decolonizing sub-Saharan countries, but also countries in North Africa like Egypt under Kemal Nasser, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, the French colonies, to, start hounding FIFA about expanding the field and allowing, more than one per, if you're lucky, one African team in the competition. Uh, right. And for him, this is not just a matter of this is what you do because, you want to decolonize the continent and indeed the world, right? But also as a way to demonstrate how good these new uh, black stars are, as a showpiece. He's very, very cognizant of this. Uh, right. And indeed, pretty much, and more about this when we actually talk about the 66 World Cup, up until really the 70s, FIFA was the most Eurocentric body on the planet. And it didn't help that at the time, right, the guy who was running it was this like upper class British civil servant dude who was totally tone deaf to the rest of the goddamn world, right? And despite the fact that by the time you get to the 60s, FIFA membership has like quadrupled because there's all these independent states in Africa, Asia, the Middle East. Uh, you know, the amount of slots open for the World Cup for these Afro-Asian countries was extremely limited, right? Uh, so, Nkrumah, this is going to be one of his pet projects, right? And he comes to, FIFA and he demands, look, we are not asking this as beggars. We are putting forward just and moderate demands, taking into the account the huge progress made by and by our, he meant not just Ghanaian, African football. And indeed, one of his legacies, I think the most important part of his legacy, because we'll talk about how this goes south in Ghana itself, is actually on the international stage. It's not just the fact that the Ghanaian national team is really good in the early 60s and is this focal point for, Pan-African unity and for the aspirations of not just Ghanaian, but all of these decolonizing peoples. It's that he's able to effectively organize the governing bodies of the federations throughout Africa to boycott FIFA in the early 60s, right? And FIFA kind of, slaps them on the wrist with fines and stuff. But the momentum of these boycotts, not just for, expanding the pool of non-European and non-Latin American, particularly South American countries, but also to the question of South Africa, right? Because while most of the world was asleep, the Ghanaians and these other African, sub-Saharan African, but also North African, right? Footballing bodies are like, hey, why does a regime that looks an awful lot like, let's be real, like, Hitler's Germany in South Africa, why are they still in your organization? Why are they still allowed to play football? Right. And why, we don't invite them to the African Cup of Nations anymore. Why are they technically still, why are you still doing business with them? Why are you still playing friendlies with these people? So the 1966 boycott is huge. Huge, 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 huge. Right. And probably, the biggest legacy, right? Because this boycott, which was really a Pan-African boycott, uh, ultimately did, again, more about this in the next episode, force some change, right? And, forced, actually created some change. And right in 1970, beginning with the 1970 World Cup qualifying, you had at least one automatic African spot. Whereas before then you had none, and the momentum of this is just going to continue and continue. Abroad, this project it does pretty well. Like I said, the boycott, which is not just Ghana, but it's a Ghanaian boycott, a Pan-African boycott, uh, does ultimately force FIFA to make some very radical changes and, become less Eurocentric. But at home, this notion that you can use football to unify your population ultimately fails, right? Because even though Ghanaians of all regional and linguistic stripes do rally around the flag to support the national team, this new Ghanaian football league looks a lot like just a cobbled together or just a unified version of the separate regional leagues that the British had set up and had used to divide and conquer, right? Uh, because Nkrumah looks at the national team as a showpiece to Africa, a showpiece to the entire decolonizing world, etc. But he also creates another showpiece. Uh, he sets up a club in Accra, in the capital, which makes sense, right? You want to unify the country around a certain set of ideas and symbols, etc., called Real Republican Sporting Club in 1961. And this is a creation of the regime. Make no mistake about that. And it is Nkrumah's little pet project. He wants to effectively turn this new club, Real Republicans, into, I don't know, Ghanaian and indeed African Real Madrid. This club from the capital that is feared and conquers all, and that is going to compete on a confederation level and also rang up stuff too, because the more Real Republicans FC win, the more Nkrumah, the more this project of Pan-Africanism and Pan-African socialism wins. Uh, right. And like I said, Real Republicans FC is it's a regime club. It was based in Accra, and right, it included not just football, it included cricket, boxing, volleyball, etc. Uh, but it it is a club that is embedded within the regime and also within the South, as opposed to the Ashanti dominated North. Right. And indeed, uh, real Republicans eventually became known as Osanvingo's own club. Osanvingo being Nkrumah's hand-picked minister of sport. So it's the minister of sports, quote unquote, club, with the letters OOC emblazoned on their playing kits and tracksuits. Right. It was a move intended to encourage Ghanaians from across the country to identify with real Republicans. The club's recruitment strategy involved the government selecting two players from each team in the domestic league. The team was coached by the national team manager, right? Because this was an era when you could, I guess, kind of do both. You saw that in Europe too. Right. And indeed, many of the Republicans' players formed the nucleuses of the African Cup winning teams from 63 and 65. The problem with this, though, is that it winds up doing exactly the opposite of what it was meant to achieve. Uh, Nkrumah wanted to use football to foster peace and harmony and to use it as a stepping stone to unify Ghana. But with the creation of this like super club, uh, right, in the capital, what you wind up having is you're creating resentment and exacerbating tensions within Ghana itself that the British had already created, right? Because real Republicans is the symbol of Southern hegemony. Then you have in the north the Ashanti-based clubs, right? And because of this quota system, they're all of those Ashanti-based clubs, their two best players get siphoned off. And indeed, what you start seeing in the Ghanaian league at this time is what you kind of see in a lot of other countries where there's one big club. Uh, Calls start going real Republicans' way. Transfers are kind of shady, right? Like if they want a player, they're going to take your player. And so this thing that Nkrumah creates to try to unify Ghana around this project within a couple of years is an abject failure because they become the club everyone in Ghana, unless you're, based in Accra, hates and despises. So actually, what you have is not, football as a unifier, but football as a divider or as something that accentuates these already present divisions within Ghanaian society. And this becomes a real problem beginning in about the mid 60s because the longer Nkrumah's in power, despite his best intentions, and partially because, like, he does nationalize the coca industry, he does throw the British advisors out of the military, and even though he's not a Marxist socialist, he replaces the British advisors, both the economic and the military ones, with people from the Soviet Union, from Yugoslavia, from Eastern Europe, and right, he takes out loans which he doesn't have to pay back from communist China. He's on the West shit list, right? And when you're on the West shit list in the Cold War, that means James Bond and his buddy Felix Leiter are going to go and try to coup your ass. And so, indeed, there is a coup attempt as early as 1962, and the regime starts to get increasingly paranoid and authoritarian in the face of, uh, actual, uh, attempts to neo-colonize, recolonize, your country and bring you into the Western orbit, which you are breaking from, the regime starts to become way more authoritarian. And right, as football and footballing success doesn't totally deliver a unified country. In fact, like I said, real Republicans ultimately, the creation of a super club in the capital actually does the exact opposite. Nkrumah starts substituting British institutions, British iconography with kind of a cult of personality. So, like part of nation building is what is your history, but who are your heroes, who are your villains? By 1965, 1966, Nkrumah is the only hero, and he's like goddamn Ghanaian Superman. He's like, he's like Stalin. He's like Mao. He's a rock star dictator, right? He is the father of the nation. He's an expert on all things, including football, right? And even though he was a degenerate fan, when the leader starts thinking that they're like the best manager, right, in the country, then it's bad. It's gone bad. So the regime and this project, which starts off with full euphoria, right? Because Ghana's at the tip of the spear, the cutting edge of this decolonization in the continent. By the mid 60s, things have gone sour. You don't see, even though you have the boycotts, which to ultimately change things in regards to FIFA and in regards to expanding the pool of African teams and in regards to shutting a white nationalist apartheid regime in South Africa, out, casting them out. Even though that is very successful, Pan-Africanism had its limits, right? By the mid 60s, you have the Biafran War in Nigeria, where it's African on African violence. Right, you have the mess that is the Congo right next door, which Nkrumah tried to mediate, and that didn't work out so well. So Pan-Africanism has its limits, partially because your economy was so tied to the West, and now you broke with them. And look, you're getting aid from China, you're getting aid from the non-aligned movement, from the Soviet Union, etc. Right, the British are not too pleased at this, and they sort of launch economic warfare. So the economy starts not doing particularly well. And his socialist projects, which were designed to actually increase equality and, level the playing field, right, that starts to crumble a bit. And again, the regime has started to become more authoritarian. Things aren't looking well. And in 1967, and we're not certain if James Bond and Felix Leiter pulled this one off, but we have strong anecdotal evidence. When Nkrumah is on a foreign visit in East Asia, he's visiting North Vietnam, North Korea, and China to negotiate more loans. Right, he is overthrown by his military. There's a coup, and almost immediately, uh, his projects, particularly the nationalization projects, get thrown out the window. And the British and the other Western economy, Western powers, and their embargo. And, a lot of these companies that were nationalized, that were brought under Ghanaian ownership, they get bought out again by, British multinationals and stuff. And the project goes sour, right? It goes sour in a really, major way. And it goes sour footballing wise too. As good as Ghana, the Black Stars were at the beginning of the decade, in 1968, so the year after the coup, they get to the final of the AFCON. They're runners up. In 1970, uh, excuse me, 1968, they win the AFCON. Uh, But then 1970, the runners up, and they failed to qualify for the World Cup, right? Which was Nkrumah's, dream, was to get the Ghanaian national team to the World Cup so that this could be this showpiece of Pan-African unity, etc. And that sets in a major decline, and a decline which, despite the fact that they made that deep run in 2010, and despite the fact that you could actually make the argument that they might have been the second best team in their group in 2014, yet they didn't advance. Ghanaian football, like a lot of these sub-Saharan African football federations, has been mired in issues relating back to the failure of decolonization. Uh, in order to grow the game and to, grow the national team, you need money. And if you don't control your own resources, and indeed, Ghana, like a lot of these countries, does not, you have a problem. Right. If, you have to constantly bail your national economy out through loans. Ghana is one of the poster children for that. It's not going to work. And right, this is where the colonial mentalities come in. We've seen a lot of great Ghanaian players in Europe. I'm not suggesting Ghanaian players shouldn't go to Europe, but your national team is only as strong and usually a reflection of the strength of your domestic league. And the Ghanaian domestic league, like a lot of these sub-Saharan African leagues, isn't great, right? Because their best and brightest dip. They leave to go to Europe very early. And right, because Ghana was a former British colony, sometimes some of your best players stop being Ghanaian and they decide to be English. The Irish know all about this, right? And this is something, again, we'll talk about when we talk about France. But, right, there's also these colonial mentalities from the FA because Ghana, although they've been slightly better, if you remember, when Ghana was winning the AFCON consistently in the 60s, they had an African manager. Now, Ghana goes to World Cups, right? Nkrumah's dream has become reality. But like a lot of these African federations, an African manager will qualify you, but because you have this fucked up colonial notion that we are African, we are backward, we are underdeveloped, the white people know what's doing, that ingrained superiority. Remember, I was talking about that before. We're going to hire some rando white guy. And right, the rando white guy doesn't know anything about the history of the uh, game in your country. He doesn't speak your language. He's literally just there, like collecting a paycheck. And so, in some ways, the expansion of the field, and again, we've seen as the World Cup has expanded its field, period, the more and more African teams. I mean, there's going to be seven or eight in 2026. Like, that's a big deal. These are the positive legacies of uh, Nkrumah's Ghana. But his dream of creating a unified Ghana, well, I mean, 2010 helped kind of, but if you know anything about Ghanaian football, those colonial, boundaries and those the bitter rivalries between the South and the North, the Ashanti dominated North, are still very much part of the fabric of the game and indeed the fabric of the society. And right, you can see hiring of foreign managers, etc. The limits of decolonization in not just Ghanaian, but really African, sub-Saharan African football. And I guess that's a good way to leave us, circling back to what I started this with. Decolonization is an ongoing process. Uh, Decolonizing Ghanaian, but also sub-Saharan African football is still going on. And right, it's an ongoing process. And it's one of the reasons too why I think a lot of us on this podcast love Alou Cisse and Senegal, because right there you had a sub-Saharan African team with an African manager who's really, really good. Take them past the group stages and actually pose a little bit of a threat. Because like I say in my decolonization courses, and I'll leave you guys with this, these countries, these places, they're not underdeveloped, they're de-developed. These are rich places. They have natural resources, they have talented people, right? But because of the long shadow of imperialism, because the wealth is getting siphoned off still, because there's this inferiority complex built in, the slave shackle in the brain. And this notion that, well, shit, we're going to get to a World Cup. We need to hire just this guy's Spanish. So, like, of course, he's better than any manager that we possibly have. Uh, these legacies are still real. And sub Saharan African football is still trying to overcome. And in that sense, Ghana, like I said, is kind of a cool case study because they're on the front lines. They're the first. And because their founding father, Nkrumah, he was an actual football fan. Like he loved this game and he explicitly saw this game as a means to transform not just his own country, but the entire world. Anyway, uh I hope you guys enjoyed this. This is Professor Matt, and this is the first of what's going to be a at least five-part series. It might be more, I don't know. But yeah, enjoy the ride. And this is the Too Many Guys Soccer Show. And I'll be seeing you in the not too distant future for an Eastern European update. Take care, gang.